And so as a boss, you can make those tiny tweaks of saying, I only email from 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. Or if I email you in off hours, there's no expectation to respond until the next day, right?
Mhm.
That gives your colleagues a sense of, oh, okay, my boss actually does really care about my mental well-being.
Welcome to API Futures, a podcast by Ascend where we empower global leaders of tomorrow. Here's our guest host for this episode.
Welcome to API Futures. I'm your guest host, David Doan, and my current role at EY or Ernst & Young is a senior manager, EY Nexus for Health Solution Architect. And what that means is I'm in a sales role and promoting sales to our hospital clients and also health plans on transformation of technology, including AI, data, and analytics. So I'm excited to have our Dr. Jenny Wang of Asians for Mental Health. And welcome, Dr. Wang. I'd love to just start off the conversation to learn about what was your first job and how did you actually got into mental health?
So my first job is kind of funny. I had played sports all through high school and then decided my senioritis kicked in spring of senior year and was like, I'm not going to play sports this season. I'm going to take a job. I'm going to be a grown up, in a way. And my first job was working at a wicker and rattan furniture shop where my friend and I filed those triplicate carbon copies of invoices. And that was like our job after school for months. So had nothing to do with mental health, but certainly kind of opened the world of professional life for me. And I was supposed to be an accountant in all truth. And I've written about this in my book, but it was the immigrant kid, right? Child of immigrants, very stable path, go into business. And all along, I knew that there was something about the human condition, about human connection that was missing in all my business courses. And so once I got to my junior year, I thought, you know what? I need to take action. I need to really understand what I wanted to do. And I took my first Psych 101 class. And I always say, like, the rest is history, right? It was the first time of my life where I felt excited. I was, just ravenous to learn and to understand something that was so outside of my scope. And coming from my culture, from my background, mental health was such a out there kind of topic. It was something that other people experienced, but not us, right? It was so taboo, so silenced. And so I think that was a realization that perhaps this was something that I could pursue and could help our community in particular. And so going to graduate training and then coming into private practice and realizing, wow, there is such a difference when there's some shared understanding of cultural values and background. And what an honor it is to do this work for our community. So that's kind of a bit of a story of my path to get to where I am today.
Wow, I just absolutely love how you just continue to find your purpose and evolve and then find like the opportunities and the gaps and anchor around kind of the cultural aspects and the importance of the cultural competent care. That is, I'm really an advocate of that, is not just having access to mental health, but also is the care that is being delivered and received by whatever various clients, demographics, are they actually culturally competent and relates to that person kind of stories and experiences. Excellent. Well, great. I love to now just kind of cite the recent kind of paper that Ascend sent out with the third report in its landmark series on API mental health and well-being in the workplace. So the paper focuses on the social cultural issues that impact the API community. And one of the major points the paper uncovers is that 70% reported feeling mentally exhausted and 60% were tense and stressed at work. Almost all API professionals experience burnout. Let's talk about what this means and the specific factors in our lives that can easily cause burnout. So I know I share a lot of the statistics. So can you share your insight on the cultural backgrounds and intergenerational trauma and potentially additional pressures and responsibilities, such as caregiving, that the API or Pan Asian community might face?
Mm-hmm. Such a great question. And I honestly believe across the board, people are feeling burnout, but I think there are certain orientations or postures within the Asian American experience and community that might actually heighten that, or perhaps put us at risk, right, of burnout. And when we think about burnout, I often think about there are lots of symptoms, but the ones that sit at the top are cynicism. So a sense of, what is this? Is this going to get better? Probably not, right? A
Mm.
sense of like pessimistic perspective, a sense of exhaustion, right? Not only are we mentally exhausted, we are physically exhausted from our work and the labor that we engage in. And then finally, a sense of decreased self-efficacy, that I don't really actually have control or impact over my workplace to bring about positive change that might be able to lessen my burnout, right? And so when we think about those aspects, a lot of times there almost develops like a learned helplessness, right? That no matter what I do, I can't change my work circumstances, my management, my team culture. These feel like problems that are too big for one person to solve. And so when we think about burnout, I always say there are individual factors and there are also collective or structural factors, right? And so when you think about individual factors, right, there are things such as the fit of your profession and your personal goals around purpose, meaning, calling, right? We know that having a sense of purpose or meaning in one's life is protective of our mental health, right? But if you're working a job where it's more about kind of the practical financial stability, but you don't really care about it, you don't feel a sense of purpose or meaning there, then that might increase your risk of burnout simply because there isn't this galvanizing purpose, right, to your work. Other individual factors, such as, struggles with mental health. And think about also individual factors around how we show up at work, right? So as an Asian American female, right, I have been socialized in many ways to be perhaps compliant, docile, passive at times. And if that is how we show up in a Western workforce, how do we get perceived? How does that translate in terms of performance and advancement, right? So there are individual factors that I think are socially constructed as well as individually internalized that make the workplace perhaps feel not very safe or not supportive, or that you don't feel like you belong. And all of those things will heighten our sense of burnout over time. Now, we also have to talk about kind of the collective or structural things that can increase burnout, right? So we're talking about time-based urgency. If you work in a job where you have to be always on all the time, right? Or expectations around team culture, right? The kind of like grinded out culture of your team or your workplace. Or even a boss that feels like they can email you at 2 a.m. and somehow expect a response 15 minutes later, right? Those are those cultural aspects that a team or manager or an organization creates explicitly or implicitly that can also heighten our sense of burnout. So I think when we think about intergenerational, let's say trauma or even coping, right, some common ideas I think are often come from the stories of our forebears, right? Given our parents' generation or even grandparents and beyond. A lot of Asian communities, might have migrated to the West due to dictatorship, colonization, right? War, famine, they came as asylum seekers or came with very little resources. So this idea of scarcity can be something that is translated down from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm.
That narrative of, I'm just lucky to be here, so I shouldn't speak up. I shouldn't say that this is wrong, or I shouldn't push back, right? If I'm being taken advantage of. That might have been something that was taught to you because your elder generations faced perhaps a lot of discrimination, right? A lot of barriers to their advancement. So being here was quote unquote enough, right? And so there's also this other side of the story, which is how achievement and productivity become perhaps an ingrained part of how you see yourself, right? Without productivity, without achievement, you may feel as though you don't have a lot of worth or value, right? And so these are narratives that often my clients will talk about that I think are steeped in the intergenerational trauma, as well as the storylines and coping, right, that our communities have had to face.
Wow, I just love how you just weave into three very different but very important topics, and they all interrelated, and you just really are awesome at storytelling, Dr. Jenny. And you also hinted something that the report also mentioned, which is the work-life balance can be particularly challenging for the API workers who often feel pressure to overwork due to cultural expectations. I'm going to give you some stats here is almost 3 out of 4 or 74% Ascend survey respondents cited work-life balance as a significant source of stress. Over half or 53% of survey respondents cited the model minority myth as a significant source of stress. I think this is similar to what I've shared not too recently, but at the 2022 convention about how we all wear a mask when we come to work. If you can talk about that modern minority myth and the pressure to excel at work, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. So to kind of like level set, model minority myth is this kind of idea that Asian Americans, and in particular East Asians, are hardworking, kind of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of people. They're often quite compliant, quite docile, kind of willing to take on all the work, right, that is kind of shifted over to us. And it is this idea that, when it was originally kind of coined in the 1960s, was this idea that of the marginalized groups or communities between Latino, Black, and Asians, we were the model. We represented family values and hardworking ethics, right? In many ways, right, sociologists have studied this and have found that it was utilized as a way to drive a wedge between marginalized individuals. So this story of how society or Western society might view Asian Americans then feeds into their expectations of perhaps how we are supposed to show up in the workplace, the grocery store, right, in our communities. And so if society says, oh, well, you're Asian American, you're supposed to be quote unquote good at math, hardworking, high wage earners, right? High levels of education, then breaking from that model or mold can feel very threatening to our identity, but it can also push us to function at a level that is above and beyond perhaps what is even expected as the specifications of our job. So this idea of excellence might be a part of kind of the way you see yourself, that not only do I have to be excellent as a colleague or a worker, I have to be excellent as a mom, right? As a parent, as a child to my parents, as a neighbor, friend, what have you. And this leads to a sense of over-functioning in so many areas of our lives, right? I've literally had clients say to me, I don't know how to function at anything below 150%. Because in their mind, when they are at 150%, that is the only definition of success. It has to be this very narrow and very specific range of forcing themselves to work. I've even had people say, if I didn't have a raging headache at the end of my workday, it felt like I didn't work hard enough. I mean, how wild is that, right? That we have framed this idea of good enough as working ourselves to physical exhaustion. And so I think one of the things that is important for us to think about is in all of the hats that you wear in your life, there are specifications, which is the minimum requirement of doing your role or job. And then there is the above and beyond, right? The range that exists. We're kind of pushing against that idea of perfectionism, which is something that a lot of my clients struggle with as well. And so for a lot of us, we might live in this range of trying to attain perfection in all of these areas. But the problem is when we try to aim for that in all those areas of life, we actually create a sense of anxiety for anything less than that margin. And so the idea of functioning at, I'm going to be an 80% parent today because I don't have capacity, or even developing awareness that I am so exhausted, I shouldn't, right, go to field day for my kids today, that I actually should take a moment to rest, right, today. That's not even in our conscious awareness, right? So I think model minority is the external mold that can be placed on us. But unfortunately, external molds can become internalized, right? We bring those expectations into ourselves. And then we get ourselves on a treadmill where we think, if I don't function at 150, I'm going to get fired. My next performance review will not be good. Right? I'll be seen as not a team player. These are all things that, can threaten our sense of well-being because we're on this treadmill that doesn't necessarily lead us anywhere, but we feel like we can't get off of it because of our fears, real or imagined, of what could happen if we're not functioning at that level.
There's so much pressure. I mean, just listening to you, I'm overwhelmed by the pressure that not just external or society, places on us, but also internalizing all of that into what we need to also feel pressure. The concept of perfectionism is almost like an impossible feat to accomplish or achieve. Absolutely. And one other thing that really sparked to me, you mentioned being compliant, docile, agreeable, all those things. Ironically, in the Western culture, those are the same characteristics that they see as a follower and not a leader. So it's almost like you're on this hamper kind of wheel that never ends. You think you're really accomplishing with all the stressors, all of the obligation, balancing everything as far as work-life balance, or I use the word work-life integration because it's almost impossible to really balance, and still you're not viewed as enough because our innate cultural tendencies and characteristics. Yeah,
That's
I
right.
just want to expand on that. But wonderful. Well, I'm going to share with you some more stats from the survey findings. More than half, or 55% of Ascend survey respondents, had not talked about mental health with their boss or colleagues. And 78% of respondents' companies offer mental health resources, but yet only 15% said their organization leadership prioritizes employee mental well-being as a great deal. So what are your thoughts about bosses, leaders, and companies? What can they do or provide more to support their API employees?
I think something that is really powerful is that modeling and leadership obviously comes from the top, right? And so when we talk about mental health, first of all, do we see our employees as whole human beings? Or do we see them as simply a tool, a cog in this large machine, right? Because if we see our employees and our teammates as whole human beings, then we're actually interested about things that happen outside of the office, right? We're interested about perhaps that a colleague's parent has been diagnosed with cancer, or we're interested in about how, someone's kids might be struggling in school. And these are all data points that would not be shared unless the bosses, leaders, and companies create a culture of psychological safety for their employees. But if you were to ask most, individuals in the workforce, I'm not sure very many of them would say that their companies prioritize psychological safety in the workplace, right? And so I think that as a leader, as a boss, as somebody with privilege and power, what does it look like? One, for you to show up as a vulnerable individual yourself, to model this idea that I'm also wholly human and I'm also having times where I struggle as well, where it's difficult, right, to do the job. And what are the things I'm doing to help myself move through this season of life? I also think that bosses implicitly will say, I care about your well-being, but not really. Because if you have a boss that emails you at 11 p.m., what does that actually say? Unless the boss says in the email, I tend to work erratic hours. There is no expectation for you to email me back at the different hours that I might be emailing you, right? But I have lots of clients who will say, my boss emails me at 11, and there's almost this unspoken expectation that I will email back within 30 minutes. That means that perhaps after they've taken care of their parent or put their children to bed, they're hopping back on the laptop to check email one last time before they go to sleep. That communicates a sense of lack of boundaries around the work life, right? And so as a boss, you can make those tiny tweaks of saying, I only email from 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. Or if I email you in off hours, there's no expectation to respond until the next day, right? That gives your colleagues a sense of, oh, okay, my boss actually does really care about my mental well-being. Even taking time off, right? Americans are the worst at taking time off. So many of them will have hours that go wasted or roll over to the next year because we don't prioritize that. Well, guess what? As a boss, if you don't take time off, how can you expect the people you lead to feel safe enough to take time off, right? So these are those small micro adjustments. Not only that, when you start a team meeting, do you start with, let's jump into the agenda and let's nail out the work? Or do we actually do a check-in, right? What's one word that's describing how everybody's feeling right now? There is something about even asking that question that helps people pause for a moment, to look inside themselves, to reorient, to think about how they're doing before they engage in the work. And so all of these are tiny tweaks and adjustments that I think can be really powerful.
Wow, there's so many great tips. Definitely a lot of modeling from leaders. There's a lot of responsibilities that leaders, and of course leaders, need to be supported by their employers and their organization culture, really have that culture be pervasive to everyone. So it's not just on the burden of the individual staff members. Lots of great tips there, even just how do you start a meeting? Because we, especially in the US culture, our style is pretty fast paced, because I know I work in a global environment where there's people that I interact with from different countries, and they actually share that comment is, we are so fast paced, we just get to the business right away and we forgot about the human aspects of things. Excellent. Well, I'm going to also kind of shift gear a little bit, just because talking about generations and how different generations may behave. we live in an overstimulated world with technology and social media. So, what are ways we can practice self care in our daily lives?
Such a great question. And I think when I think about self care, I divide it into two categories. So, one category is what I would say kind of like short term dissociative self care.
Hmm.
And the other category is more restorative, things that might actually bring you into what we call a flow state, right? Psychologically. And so a lot of times, self care can be disengagement. It's just like, let me get on my phone, let me open up whatever app and mindlessly scroll, right? And for some people, that break is maybe all they can get in a long work day. And in the short term, maybe it's enough to kind of disengage your mind from the intensity of work or the pace of work and then re engage, right?
Hmm.
If we're honest, whether or not it's truly helpful to you, a lot of us do that, right? As a form of self care. Now, in the short term, it's fine, right? We all do it. But the problem is that dissociative self care or those actions don't provide long term results or change, right? It's very short snippets where we can kind of turn the brain off. What I think we actually need to prioritize is the restorative self care, right? It's not massages or bubble baths or what have you. It is how do we come into the moment in terms of mindfulness, engagement, slowing the nervous system down enough such that it can even enter into restoration, right? And that includes kind of the not so sexy things like sleeping earlier, eating right balanced nutrition, drinking water, moving your body. All of these things have a long-term perspective in mind, right? You may not see change in a short term, but we do them and maintain them such that we are kind of the best versions of ourselves that we can call up each day, right? On top of that, we have to think about how human connection is such an important part of our human existence, right? So, as tribal beings, being with people that see you, make you feel as though you belong, that is such a crucial part of helping the nervous system co regulate, reminding ourselves that we are safe despite the stressors of the day or of the work. There's also the human maintenance aspects, right? Spending time with your partner, spending time with your family, spending time with friends who understand you, and even colleagues, right? Going out to dinner or grabbing drinks after work. That can be something that helps us feel as though we are not alone in all of these struggles.
It's beneficial for me to listen to this because I sometimes don't prioritize my self care needs and what I want. I love how you spoke on the restorative side of giving examples of how to feel that. And living in the moment is such a simple thing to say, but it can be very hard to practice. The other thing about living in the moment is you appreciate the past, but sometimes not ruminating on the past. That's also important. And then we are so, anxious about how to care for ourselves and our family and just different generations of your family. So you think about the future all the time that you can't live in the moment or live in the present. You know what? This has been so insightful. I'm going to kind of close this out by asking a question that is very interesting how you might want to respond to it. Is how do you see or what does the future look like for API mental health personally or professionally, or what would you want it to be?
Great question. I think my hope is that our community sees each of us as personally charged in starting to remove the stigma around mental health, right? So I always say to my clients that you, as a person that utilizes mental health support, are the best walking advertisement for, right, professional mental health services, right? And so What does it look like for our community to say, hey, I'm going to break the silence around perfectionism, this image of having these lives that are, oh, so great, right, on pictures in social media. What does it look like for our community to remove the mask, right, and say that saving face is not how we're going to choose to live, but instead to be authentic and real with each other? I always tell folks that one of the most powerful gifts that you can give to people is the gift of going second. And what I mean by that is when you go first, you take the courage and the fear that comes with sharing about personal struggle, personal mental health difficulties, right? You give others the gift of being able to go after you because you've shown vulnerability in a way that can be very rare in modern society. And so when we are willing to share vulnerability, it gives other people the permission to do the same. And in truth, most people will never show up in my office, right? Most people will not see a mental health professional, but they will see you. They will see colleagues. They will see friends and family members. And so by normalizing conversations around mental health, I think we can improve future generations, right? Where we start to say mental well-being is something that we all have, and it's something that we can all individually and collectively work towards, right? For the benefit of ourselves and those who come after us. And when I think about professionally, I think at the end of the day, right, workplaces are going to be stressful at times. But when we are stressed and we feel like we have people who have our backs, we feel as though there are people who will defend and advocate for us, who will make us feel like we belong. That is like a balm for that stress, right? So what does it look like for us to show up in those ways for our colleagues, right? To say, I've got your back. I'm watching out for you. When you're not in the room, I have you in mind as I'm talking to people and negotiating, right? And I'm going to be able to or willing to defend you even, right? How much safer would our workplaces be if that's something that we all kind of committed to? And you don't have to do it for everybody in your workplace, right? You can say, these are my safe people. This is my tribe, my community, and I'm going to take care of these people, right? And all of us just need to pick a couple in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be enough, right? For that impact to be felt and seen in the workplace.
Beautifully said. I take what you just shared with me and summarize it in a way that I do think the future of API mental health is hopeful. Hopeful is a good word
It
because
is.
I do, with the dialogue that we're having today and many other dialogues that I know exist out there at large, I think it is a positive step that we're taking. So thank you so much, Dr. Jenny. And I also think companies are starting or continue to realize the importance of supporting the employees' mental health. Those who work for employers that do have a rich set of mental health benefits that they can access, through perhaps galvanized by the unfortunate pandemic situation.
Yeah.
We all benefit from all that. Another thing about being hopeful is your message is very clear that each of us takes part in this. We can be mental health advocates. We can have a community of paraprofessionals. Of course, there is something to be said about seeking professional help, which is still that stigma that seems to deter many of us. I am very curious if there's something that is related to maybe older generations or not. But I still think overall, the Pan Asian community can be more courageous in seeking out mental health and professionals who actually, like you, who actually can guide them through life experiences. I have one more question because I'm
Okay.
always I always say things to to people I mentor or informally or not is to be kinder to yourself. And I also know that I've gone to therapy when I have to look at my younger child and younger self. What advice would you give your younger self? You've
Mm,
yeah.
great question. I think I would tell my younger self that life at times will feel scary and very difficult.
Mm,
And yet, you will find within yourself and the people that you love the strength to overcome those dark moments.
mm,
And that in doing so, you will be forever transformed as a
mm.
human being and better for it.
I literally just got goosebumps. If you even know part of my story, I needed to hear that. I'm gonna probably listen to this and click on replay. Wow, really appreciate you, Dr. Jenny, for your insight. But you speak from a very humanistic approach, and I absolutely treasure that. It's
Thank you.
also I think I repeat myself over and over is I hope this conversation inspire people to help others, listen and actively listen to others, but do something for yourself, like self-care. Yes, don't forget about you because in our community, in our culture, we are so good at taking care of other people. So
That's right.
listen and hear what Dr. Jenny has shared, and it was so eloquently delivered. So I will just say thank you so much for listening and appreciate our time together, Dr. Jenny.
Thanks for listening to API Futures, presented by Ascend, where we empower global leaders of tomorrow. Subscribe to API Futures on Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple.